Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and still I rise. And I rise, Mr. Speaker, a liberated, unbought, unbossed, fearless, unafraid Democrat. I rise to Speaker with a special message, one that concerns events that transpired right here on the floor of the House of Representatives last night. I rise, Mr. Speaker, to speak truth to power and truth about power. To speak truth to power, you have to simply say to power, we have a problem, and let us solve the problem. But if you speak truth about power, you say, power, there's a problem, and you're it. I'd like to address both. Let's start with the genesis of what occurred last night, and that genesis is a meme in some worlds, but it was actually something AI concocted, and it had President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama being represented as apes, portrayed as apes. I find this unacceptable, and a good many people of goodwill found it unacceptable as well. Well, as a person of goodwill finding this unacceptable, I wanted to do more than simply tweet something about it or write something about it. I wanted the president to know that people of goodwill will confront him and let him know that he's doing things that are unacceptable. It is unacceptable to portray Homo sapiens, especially persons of African ancestry, as apes, a little bit more than in some worlds of the ape family, and a little bit less than a Homo sapien. Something that's sort of in a twilight zone, maybe the missing link, if you will, where we're not the missing link. We're as human as anybody else, and we're going to demand the respect that everybody else is accorded. This is not a world where you're going to relegate some human beings to a lower life form simply because it pleases you and a host of people that you happen to communicate with. This is unacceptable. So right here, I sat on this row. I was over one seat away from the aisle, but when the president approached, I then approached the aisle. And when I approached the aisle, I wanted him to see a sign that I had that simply said, but it was truthful, I believe it was powerful. Black people are not apes. Black people aren't apes. And I flashed that for the president to see. Based upon the way he turned away and tried to move briskly, it appears that he got the message but did not want to embrace the message. And as a result of this, he made his way up to give his speech, and I continued to stand silently holding my signage. My signage was my means of silently protesting. There were other persons over in this area who were protesting, and they were doing it peacefully. They had on signage. It was displayed on a cap, is what I saw on one person. A cap, and it had language on it. These kinds of things are done in this chamber quite regularly. If someone thinks it's too often, I won't differ with them, but we'll all have to stop if we're going to stop. Some of us, every one of us, will have to behave in a similar fashion. Well, I stood there with my signage, and my colleagues became rather disturbed about it. I did not create a disturbance. I stood there silently. They created the disturbance. They're the people who grabbed and ripped my signage. They're the people who said things to me as I traversed the aisle and tried to make my way out of the chamber. They're the people who became rather rambunctious and behaved in some ways in an unacceptable fashion. So if there is to be some concern about who created the disturbance, then you have to look at the video and you will see. I'm saying this to you because I have heard talk of someone wanting to censure me again. I have already been censured. This happened some time ago. And I have signage that I use to indicate that while I have been censured, my signage indicates that I have not been silenced. And I will not be silenced. Censured but not silenced. This is when the president was here for a joint session of Congress, and the president was indicating that he had a mandate, and I wanted him to know that he didn't have a mandate to cut Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security. And I spoke up. I was seated in that very same area, and for this, I was removed and I was censured. But for this that occurred last evening, there should not be a censorship of me. If anybody is going to be censured, it should be the people who became so rambunctious as to create a disturbance. I didn't do that. I silently stood, and I would do it again. The first time when I engaged the president, it was with spontaneity. I did not plan this. I responded to this because I was concerned about Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And well, I should have been, because about $1 trillion has been cut from health care. And we are still fighting to get subsidies so that people can pay premiums that they can afford. This is a part of that affordability that the president refuses to recognize. But I did this with a degree of spontaneity. It was not planned. What I did last night was planned. But it was only planned after I did have a conversation with my staff and asked them to tell me why I should and should not come over. We had that conversation, and I made the decision myself. My staff did not make the decision, but I welcomed their input. And I came here to behave as I did and engage in peaceful, silent protest. Peaceful, silent protest. However, my colleagues caused it to metamorphose into something that was less than what some persons would call the standards that we've set for ourselves here in the House of Representatives. So I'm not going to give a long message today. I wanted to make this message clear such that people would understand that I believe in what I did. The president should not portray persons of African ancestry as apes. This is unacceptable given the history in this country of caricatures such as this being utilized against people of color at an earlier time. And the president would take us back to those ugly days when you could call black people N-words with impunity, when you could demand that black people show respect that was not deserved, when black people were relegated to the back of the bus, they were relegated to the balcony of the movie and the bottom of the jails. This is unacceptable. Black people are not going back, Mr. President. Black people are going to move forward with the rest of this country.